As you mentioned, in the minds of some Americans, after 9/11, the religion of Islam was associated with, maybe you could say, evil in the world.
Hmm.
Maybe you can say terrorism. How can you respond to this association? How does it make you feel, first of all, as a devout Muslim yourself, and um, how can you overcome it personally? How can you overcome it as a community and as a religious leader?
It's interesting because 9/11 now, we're talking over 21 years ago.
There's
9/11.
people born after 9/11,
It's
and you get to
crazy.
talk to them all the time.
Yeah. So when I'm talking to young Muslims, I'm
Yes.
talking about post 9/11, post 9/11. They're like, I was born in 2005. What are you talking about post 9/11? I'm like, well, I remember being a teenager. I remember being in high school when this happened, right? So a lot of us
Yeah.
that experienced 9/11 as high schoolers or as college students and remember distinctly what it was like to be a Muslim pre 9/11 and post 9/11, we can relate to that experience and we could identify that juncture, very clearly and talk about it and speak to the change in the perceptions of Islam that happened here in the United States and around the world. But a lot of young people are born into that reality and are experiencing the aftermath of it. And, unfortunately, have to deal with the bigotry that has uh, not just, taken greater shape in media constructions of Islam, but also policies, right? A lot of the civil liberties of the Muslim community were taken away from us. You read about the Patriot Act, you read about the securitization of the Muslim community and some of the unfair practices that have been engaged by the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and continue into the Biden administration. International Islamophobia. And so the hatred of Muslims and the bigotry that is wielded against Muslims on the basis of this idea that we are a barbaric people that ascribe to a religion of hate and violence um, has had immediate consequences for us, no matter where we are in terms of our age and in terms of our experience. We have dealt with that in different ways. Now, the association of Islam to terrorism is a lazy association. It's one that ignores both the history of violence as well as its everyday occurrence. We're good for how many mass shootings a year? When's the last time you heard of a Muslim carrying out a mass shooting in America? Right? How many of those mass shootings, if you were to scrub the social media, 400, 500 mass shootings a year? If you were to scrub the social media of some of those that carried out those shootings, we're good for one or two idiots a year, right? It's unfortunate that you're going to have people that carry out despicable acts of violence. But when we as Muslims hear someone in the media say terrorism has been ruled out as a possibility, while the blood is still on the floor of that Walmart, we already know that the police chief just said that that wasn't a Muslim. Don't worry, that wasn't an Al Qaeda guy or an ISIS guy. It was one of our own, right? And so it's become frankly ridiculous because the association of violence with Islam is one that is used to actually carry out acts of violence against Muslims worldwide. It justifies bad policy towards Muslims worldwide and then in the United States. And it's just factually so lazy. There was a study just about how the media gives more attention to acts of violence done by Muslims and immediately stamps it with Islam up to 300% more than it will with another act of violence carried out in the name of anything else. So you don't hear about the acts of violence that are carried out by others. You don't hear about the religion of the perpetrators. You don't associate terrorism with actions, frankly, of state terrorism. When governments launch chemical attacks or drone weddings and do so while explicitly dehumanizing the people, just because they do so with the government apparatus doesn't make it any less terroristic than if it's a lone person that goes out and commits an act of violence trying to achieve a political goal. So the association is lazy, historically speaking. the Crusades. I grew up in Louisiana. I saw Klan rallies, Ku Klux Klan rallies my whole life. And people said, well, that's a thing of the past. Well, guess what? We see many semblances, many acts that are carried out with the same vitriol that was generated by the Ku Klux Klan. We have people standing in front of our mosques that belong to right-wing hate militias carrying AR-15s, talking about wanting to inflict harm on Muslims. I have been to Christchurch, New Zealand, and buried the victims of a white supremacist terrorist who was inspired by the political rhetoric here in the United States, in his own words, in his manifesto, to go and kill 50 innocent people in Christchurch, New Zealand, one of the most peaceful cities in the world. And by the way, Lex, I mean, it's really interesting, like with Christchurch, the man wanted, and I won't even say his name, but his next target after the two mosques, had he not been stopped, was to go to a Muslim daycare. So what drives someone to dehumanize people to that extent that he was willing to go to a daycare and murder a bunch of kids because he saw them as a demographic threat to civilization? So Muslims are terrorized because they are falsely depicted as terrorists. Muslims suffer domestically and globally because of this false association. It's a lazy association. And when someone comes around and says, well, fine, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims, I say that you clearly don't read statistics. Whether we're talking about the 20th century, and I'm a student of history, and I believe you are as well, all the isms, World War I, World War II, had nothing to do with religion, certainly had nothing to do with Islam. Fascism, Soviet atheism, right? Many of these systems where people were murdered in the millions, Nazism, the Holocaust, Rwanda, Cambodia, I can go on and on. The Rohingya today, the greatest atrocity towards the Uyghurs. Where does Islam fit in all of this? People do horrible things. They stamp it with religion at times. But the only group of people that seem to suffer after an act of violence is committed are Muslims, because any act of violence that is committed by a Muslim will immediately be blamed on Islam, and 2 billion people will have to carry the burden of the act of a single perpetrator.
And just to reiterate, in case the numbers are not known, you mentioned Christchurch. Those are 2 mosque shootings with 51 people killed and 40 were injured in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So it's hate manifesting itself in actual human suffering and destruction.
Absolutely.
Is there similarities between anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate? So is there something deeper to say about hate in general here that is beyond just particularly hate towards Muslims?
Absolutely. Look, in Pittsburgh, the synagogue shooting, the perpetrator particularly targeted that synagogue because
Tree of Life Synagogue.
11
killed, 6 wounded in 2018.
Because he believed that they were taking in Syrian refugees or supporting Syrian Muslim refugees. You think about that. The San Diego synagogue shooting that took place shortly after. He went to a mosque and then he went to a synagogue. Look, the idea of scapegoating minority populations and attributing to them a disproportionate sense of power and a nefarious element where they can't be trusted. And unless we wipe them out, then they're going to wipe us out, underlies many of the bigotries that exist. I mean, look, after Trump announced his Muslim ban, there was a shooting in Canada, an attack in Canada on a mosque in Quebec, where 6 people were killed. The shooter explicitly said that the reason why he went to that mosque in Quebec and shot dead 6 Muslim worshippers was because he was afraid that because of the ban on Syrian refugees in the United States, they would come to Canada, and he didn't want them to feel welcomed in Canada. So there is a connection. And I think it's when you are able to dehumanize large groups of people and attribute a nefarious element to them then unfortunately, in a world that's becoming more and more polarized, where people are able to construct their entire worldviews based on an algorithm that their social media caters to, you're going to have some of these attacks happen. And there's going to be an unfortunate connection between them. So what I tell people is that, I think with all of these people that shoot up synagogues and shoot up mosques, and even before that, actually, the Charleston, South Carolina shooting at an AME church, when he went there, he actually said that before he murdered 9 worshipers in that church, he was taken aback by how nice they were to him. He sat there for 2 hours before he turned a gun on many people who were over the age of 80 years old and murdered them in cold blood. So this is what I talk about when I say that as human beings, we have the propensity, unfortunately, to become worse than devils, or we can choose to be angelic when we choose worship and righteousness over ourselves. So that's a spiritual crisis as well, and a crisis of meaning and emptiness, where I think people are willing to inflict great pain on others when they can't make sense of their pain in their own lives.
I'd like to try to figure out together with you sort of a way out to try to decrease the amount of hate in the world, but maybe it's useful to talk about the BBC documentary that it's kind of interesting that people should check out. It's called United States of Hate, Muslims Under Attack. And you appear in that. You have conversations with people who are anti-Muslim. And I believe most of it takes place here in Dallas.
Yeah.
And can you just tell me about this little documentary about that time, what it was like to interact? What was the group in the documentary, and what was it like to interact with them?
In the very beginning of the rise of, at that time, actually, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, like when Islamophobia was at the center of many of the presidential candidates' campaigns at the time.
So this must have been 2015.
Yes, 2015. The mayor of Irving at the time, Beth Van Dyne, who is now a congresswoman, had put out the idea that Muslims were operating a Sharia court in Irving, Texas. And suddenly there was a hysteria because, again, there's the idea that Muslims are here to dominate. Muslims are here to overthrow everything that you have in the United States. There was a hysteria here. And it was unfortunate because what it unleashed, especially with the national discourse at the time, again, the presidential campaign, Donald Trump says, "I think Islam hates us." When he uses those words, "I think Islam hates us." When Ted Cruz suggests that Muslim neighborhoods could be patrolled or should be patrolled. And then you have the Irving mayor saying that one of the most populated cities with Muslims in America, they're operating under an alternate legal system. And funny enough, the year before that, she'd come to the mosque and she praised the diversity of Irving. And she was talking about how welcome she felt in the mosque. And the next thing we know, you have these crazy white supremacist groups, openly white supremacists that affiliate themselves with the Klan and others, protesting regularly in front of our mosques with their AR-15s and telling people to go back home. And I'm like, I'm from New Orleans. I'm not planning to move back to New Orleans. I'm home. We're home. We're good. We're staying put. And we refuse to be intimidated. But then when the Syrian refugee crisis is unfolding as well, Dallas has been one of the more popular destinations, if you will. I'm not talking about it like a vacation destination, but where a lot of refugees have come to just because of the infrastructure that we have set up here to receive refugees. And so that hysteria was an unfortunate, perfect combustion of the national discourse with the local discourse with the incoming refugees. And we would do all sorts of welcome refugee events. And we do that, and we don't only do that for Muslim refugees, by the way. There are refugees from other parts of the world as well. But we would host events at our mosques, to welcome refugees, to help integrate them into the community, to do things for them. So you have these armed protests happening, right? And it's horrible because think about the trauma to the children that are hearing about Tree of Life and hearing about some of these other incidents that are unfolding. And really one of the first communities that was targeted was the Sikh community in Madison. That was one of the first shootings. And then the AME Church, Charleston. And then you just had tons of places of worship being targeted, right? So they're seeing this unfold, and then they're seeing these guns in front of their mosques. And the result to many is, well, I just don't want to get shot. I don't want to go to the mosque. I don't want to have this happen to me. So, when BBC reached out and said, we want to do a documentary about this, unfortunately, Dallas was the only place in America where you had regular armed groups in front of our mosques. It was happening around the country infrequently, but here it was happening every week. So the BBC reached out and said, we want to interview you. And I said, we've got this idea. We want to take you to a park and have you meet one of the protesters who's been wielding his gun outside your mosque and talk to him. And it was really interesting because they'd interviewed him before meeting me, and the things that he was able to utter before meeting me and before meeting Syrian refugees was just awful. I mean, the most dehumanizing rhetoric that you can imagine. But then at the park, he meets me, talks to me. He meets a Syrian refugee family. One of the girls whose leg had been blown off in an airstrike. And he said, I feel like an idiot. I mean, he expressed all sorts of regret and was teary-eyed that he could dehumanize people the way that he was. And so my whole thing was, and is, come inside the mosque, put your gun down, disarm yourself, and learn. And you'll be surprised what you'll walk away with. And it only took one meeting with him to completely shift his worldview at the time, which was made up of heroes and villains, the Muslims unfortunately being the villains that had to be wiped off the face of the earth so that the earth could continue. So that was an interesting documentary, and it was an interesting social experiment.
What's it feel like to have all these people that hate you and others in the community, people you love, with guns, threatening violence, basically that don't want you here in this country, on this earth?
It's not nice. It's not great. I mean, it's definitely a challenge. But look, there are challenges that we face as Muslims, being in the United States, being in a hostile climate. And there are different types of challenges. And I think what we've had to do as a Muslim community is see beyond both the guns and the roses and think about who we are first. Because frankly, Islamophobia exists in different forms and from different sides. And we try to use this as an opportunity to instill in our young people not just a sense of belonging, but a sense of purpose. Do not be intimidated. And in fact, show them the best of your Islam. Live your life, because at the end of the day, the goal that is sought through intimidation is silence. And so we have to carry ourselves as proud American Muslims. We don't have to impress anyone. And we don't need to relinquish an iota of our faith to coexist with anyone. We are satisfied with who we are. We don't see a contradiction between our place of residence and our religion, our nationality, our religion. We don't see that as a problem, right? So that's something for them to work out, not for you to work out. That's what I would tell young Muslims, that continue to live your faith fully and demonstrate the beauty of it, and do not let the ugliness of the world consume you.
But for those young Muslims, what would you say how they should feel towards the people that hate them? The natural human, there's a desire still to have anger, to have resentment, to have hate back at the people that hate you.
The Quran says, respond to that which is evil with that which is better. And you will find that sometimes your enemy will become your close friend. So respond with that which is better. Doesn't mean be passive. Sometimes there needs to be a demonstration of strength. Sometimes there needs to be a demonstration of ignoring a people altogether. But ultimately, you can't let the way people treat you shape who you're going to be in the world. And so that's why I say we have to look beyond the guns and the roses. We have to look beyond the hostility of our enemies and the temporary and opportunistic embrace of some of those who claim to be our allies, and be us and treat the world and treat the people of this world in accordance with your standards, not with theirs. So don't teach them, or don't let them teach you bad character. You teach them good character. So live your life and live your faith beautifully, and let people see the beauty of it through your being, and do not let their ugliness consume you. But at the same time, sometimes you got to give people room to express frustration, to say that this is unacceptable, to have demonstrations of strength. And I think that those things don't have to all contradict each other.
Yeah, what do you think about these kinds of protests are not allowed in many parts of the world? What do you think about one of the most, to you directly, personally painful manifestations of the First Amendment, of the people's right to freedom of speech and to protest, to say hateful things? You've been at the receiving end of the worst of it. What do you feel about this particular freedom that's at the core of the founding of this country?
Look, I think that you have to take it away from the text and look at it within reality. Let's be real. Would Muslims be able to protest in front of churches with guns on a weekly basis in this country? I don't think so.
So there's a deep, pragmatically speaking, there's a hypocrisy to what's allowed and not.
Major hypocrisy. See, free speech is an ideal that is weaponized against the Muslim community and against other communities in such a hypocritical way. You take, for example, some countries in Europe. Let's kind of move away from this and look at the hypocrisy of a place like France, where the caricaturing and the portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in derogatory ways will be used as the hallmark of free speech. But Muslims that will caricature Macron or challenge some of the values of France, the supposed enshrined values of France, will end up in prison and end up deported. And so here in the United States, there's a great hypocrisy. I don't think that places of worship should have armed protesters in front of them. I think that poses a security risk. I think that it's not okay. And I think that free speech is weaponized against the Muslim community and often is held up as this great value, but really to attain very lowly things, and is often to our detriment.
Yeah, just even watching that documentary, it's hard to put into words, but somehow that does not capture what maybe the founders intended.
Right.
What I would see is the great ideal of the freedom of speech. I don't know what the solution to that is. I think taking it outside of words, maybe that requires a community, a cultural pressure to be better. So it's not about the law, it's more about just the cultural pressure. What is and isn't okay. Because there's something deeply wrong about that kind of hate. Yeah, because it was dehumanizing other people that are here in America, that they're Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it's we have to interrogate the foundations of our country when our country is in such turmoil and such chaos. No country in the world has the mass shootings that we have. No country in the world has some of the polarization that we have. We have to interrogate that and say what it is that we're doing wrong that's leading to that. And I think, again, that it's reaching a point where it's unsustainable. If we don't do better and try to solve some of the rifts right now that exists in our society, then we're going to end up in a place where we may not be able to climb out of this.